Welcome to the Cities of Migration Learning Exchange. Today's webinar topic explores inclusion of migrants with irregular status, a role for cities. Against a background of heated public debate and a worrisome pushback on immigration, on refugees, and even about diversity, a growing number of cities in Europe are not only embracing their diversity and championing immigrant integration, they are actively taking steps to recognize and connect the undocumented and their families to services in the city. So why do cities reach out to migrants with irregular status? Why should they? And how are they doing it? Today we'll learn about some of the practical and innovative ways in which local authorities are responding to this challenge and pressing reality. We are joined today by leaders in the field. I am delighted to welcome our guests from Oxford in the United Kingdom. We're joined by Sarah Spencer, Director, Global Exchange on Migration and Diversity Campus at the University of Oxford. And in Utrecht, Netherlands, we are joined by Jan Braat, Senior Policy Advisor, Migration and Integration with the City of Utrecht. So now, to share insights from the Multi-City CMEs initiative on migrants with irregular status in Europe, I am delighted to introduce our first guest speaker, Sarah Spencer. Dr. Sarah Spencer is Director of the Global Exchange on Migration and Diversity, which is the learning exchange arm of the Center on Migration Policy and Security, better known as COMPASS, where she is a senior fellow at the University of Oxford. Sarah's research focuses on irregular migrants in Europe, on which she holds an Open Society Fellowship, and on migrant integration with a particular interest in policy making at the local level. Sarah's earlier career was in the public and voluntary sectors. She is former Deputy Chair of the Commission for Racial Equality, former Chair of the Equality and Diversity Forum, a British network of equality and human rights organizations, and former director of the human rights NGO Liberty. Sarah was recently elected chair of the board of directors of IMISCO, the network of European research centers that focus on migration and integration issues. Sarah also is honored with an OB, the Order of the British Empire, for her work in this field. So we're delighted to welcome you. Sarah, over to you. The podium is yours.
Tim, thank you. It's a real pleasure to join you in this, and it's wonderful that you're giving some priority to this particular issue. In my short presentation, I'm just going to talk about why cities reach out in terms of providing a level of access for irregular migrants to public services and sometimes to documentation. Certainly if I can get it to work, that is.
Here we go.
There we go. So start off first by just saying, who are we talking about? Irregular migrants. Well, citizens from outside the European Union who are within the European Union but haven't fulfilled their conditions of entry or stay. They're a diverse group. Some enter without permission at all, but many enter legally to work or join family, study, or to apply for asylum, but then later don't comply with their conditions of their visa, or they overstay, and many will have applications pending to remain. Data is a problem. We don't know how many there are with irregular status in the EU. The most recent officially accepted estimate from the Clandestino project was sort of up to 0.8% of the population, but that's 10 years ago, and it's thought that it will have risen since then and will rise more because of the number of people who applied for asylum after the Mediterranean crisis of the last couple of years, who are refused and then don't leave. We know that the return rate is only about 36% from the EU, so we can only expect that the numbers will go up. The problem, of course, is the concentration in certain cities and neighborhoods of cities that makes it more of a challenge there rather than the number across the EU as a whole. But in cities, it is a challenge. While many people are working or supported by family and friends, and so will only come to the attention of the authorities perhaps when a child needs to go to school or someone needs medical or treatment, others become destitute, and then they need shelter and access to essential services. And that poses a policy challenge actually for national governments as well as for local government. one or two photographs here. I think Jan will tell you about the situation in Utrecht, which led to their policy making. Photograph here of Barcelona, where irregular migrants were living in abandoned industrial property, which raised public safety issues. A long-term protest over 2 years, right in the heart of Berlin, by asylum seekers and refused asylum seekers, an encampment there. And then recently, the terrible tragedy of Grenfell Tower in central London, where subsequently charities reported that some of the victims were unwilling to come forward to seek help, even though they were homeless, or indeed to give evidence, because they feared deportation. And that led the government to issue a temporary amnesty for them so that they could come forward and get help. And that illustrates the trade-offs, in a way, the compromises that there can be in policy making when there are competing policy priorities that conflict with the national government's primary focus on enforcement. In doing this short presentation, I'm drawing on our research, a study across the European Union looking at national and local responses, and then an in-depth study in the UK looking at local authority responses to children and families with no recourse to public funds, many of whom are irregular. But also, as you mentioned, Kim, this learning exchange initiative, the City Initiative on Irregular Migrants in Europe, which is ongoing, where 11 cities have come together to talk about their experiences, and I'll tell you a little bit more about them in a moment. The background to this, of course, is that there's an expectation that cities will foster integration of regular migrants, and there's now, of course, it's standard for there to be strategies for doing that and many initiatives, and Cities of Migration has helped a lot with that. But there isn't the same expectation in relation to those whose status is irregular, because, of course, they're subject to enforcement action. But it's interesting that, nevertheless, governments themselves recognise the need for access to some services. The mapping we did showed that all European Union countries allow access to emergency health care, for instance, although some do require payment. Some allow quite a lot more than that, access to hospital care, maternity, and full care for children, the same as for citizen children. And in relation to school, 10 countries have a specific entitlement in law that the children will be allowed to have school education regardless of immigration status. And elsewhere, they're simply included within the all children may attend. What's interesting is that some countries have actually recently extended access to services for irregular migrants, most notably in Sweden, where healthcare had been very restricted but is now much more extensive. Spain, a special provision for victims of domestic violence who otherwise wouldn't feel able to come forward and tell the police what had happened to them. And the UK, another example, treatment for HIV AIDS was allowed in 2012. And when we look at why, take that particular example, the driver there was public health. The evidence was absolutely clear that if you want to prevent the spread of HIV AIDS, you can't afford to exclude a section of the population from testing and treatment. And then if we look at the Swedish example, Sweden prided itself on the high level of medical care and on the administration of medical records, for instance, and that conflicted with the level of care that could be provided by NGOs in their informal clinics with volunteer medical staff. And essentially what we see here is competing policy priorities which governments couldn't ignore. Nevertheless, the policy norm on access to services is highly restrictive, and that creates challenge for local government. Essentially, the priorities of local government can differ from those of national government, as we know in relation to integration of regular migrants. They have different responsibilities at the local level, and this means that they cannot ignore the basic needs of the people with irregular status who are actually present on their streets. As this Dutch public health worker said, it's not that the cities are challenging the government's priority of enforcement, but saying government doesn't understand the reality that we need to deal with while people are actually living in our cities. and the Greek city politician there saying we have to respect the law, but there's also law in relation to needing to eat, and if you can't eat, you steal, and that's breaking the law. So there were conflicting priorities here, which the cities are having to work with. And it leads them to provide a range of services, some cities providing a number of services, some perhaps just one, but healthcare, nursery education, legal advice and representation quite often, because that helps to resolve people's immigration status and tackle the underlying problem. It can help cities deal with voluntary returns. Occasionally cities are engaging in skills training, job search, in recognition that people will be often allowed to stay. And sometimes they are actually trying to provide places in which people can report that they've been the victims of crime without being deported. Sometimes the cities are doing this directly, providing it through their own staff. Often they're doing it in partnership or through an NGO, a voluntary organisation. When we ask them why they're doing this, and we did this in our research, but also with the cities in the Learning Initiative, there's essentially, although humanitarian concerns are there, medical ethics is there, human rights values are there, the big answer we get is that the exclusion of irregular migrants prevents them achieving their other policy goals. It prevents them dealing with homelessness and street sleeping. It prevents them tackling crime if people won't come forward and report it. It's a problem for the image for the city. Tourists don't want to come, businesses don't invest, and so on. Public health if people don't come forward for vaccinations. Managing public services, it's difficult if everybody goes to the emergency department instead of having access to primary care. And then there are legal duties, like in the UK, local authorities have a statutory duty to protect children in need, regardless of immigration status. So there's a whole range of very, if you like, pragmatic reasons why cities are providing a level of access to services in ways that go sometimes a bit beyond what national governments would prefer. And it's a different combination of reasons for different services and in different cities. What we find is that cities often have to stretch the rules to be able to make this provision. Not break the rules, but police, for instance, not passing on information on immigration status that they're aware of when someone's a victim of crime, as in this Belgian city example, because they want people to come forward with the information. Or this in Austria, a city-funded healthcare provider says the city and the ministry don't ask us about the migrants, although they know perfectly well that many of them have irregular status. Or the Greek example of providing food. The law doesn't allow them to provide it to irregular migrants, so they simply make sure there's enough for everyone, and they don't ask about immigration status. But this ambiguity is a problem for the staff. I was very struck by this Danish example of a social worker who works with the homeless, who said, everybody within the city administration knows the work we're doing with homeless people who have irregular status, but there's no policy, there's nothing written down, there's no specific budget on this because it's politically difficult, and that's the biggest challenge in my job, he said, acceptance and non-acceptance. And it's also a problem for NGOs that they have to know who to talk to, which organisation, which department to approach, which person within the department to approach, and it's a sort of grey zone which they can manage if they know, but NGOs who don't know, and of course it's impossible for migrants to know how to manage this. So the question is, how sustainable is this arrangement in the long run? Funding through NGOs is another way in which the local authorities can avoid the controversy of providing the service directly, or indeed avoid reporting duties, which in countries like Germany, where a public service is required to pass on information, on an irregular migrant to the immigration authorities. If you provide the service through an NGO, you can avoid that. And I was intrigued by this Finnish example when the city was asked if it could provide a grant for a day centre, and the NGO promised that they would only provide it to legal residents, and the city's reply was, our condition is that you don't ask about immigration status because actually we need you to include those who don't have it. And the Dutch example there saying, essentially, it's a grey area if it's provided by NGOs. Not too many people are aware of it. It's not too visible, and that's very helpful. But the question is this sustainable, and is this the most effective way for cities to be able to address the challenge they face? Unlike in relation to regular migrants, there isn't a lot of dialogue. There hasn't been dialogue between cities on this more sensitive issue. That's why they wanted to come together into this initiative, the CMI's initiative, which is ongoing at the moment. They're meeting over 2 years. We facilitate that, but it's also been adopted by the Eurocities Working Group on Migration and Integration. And their aim is to share experiences, to learn from each other, hopefully learn from the research evidence that we provide as well, to raise awareness of the issue and promote dialogue on it, to consider reforms at the EU level which would help cities address the challenges effectively, and as an output to produce guidance for municipalities across Europe on the different ways in which you can provide services to address these problems. That's what we're preparing at the moment, and we need more examples. So if there are people from cities or indeed NGOs who know about this and have examples of initiatives that cities or smaller municipalities are taking on any of the sorts of issues that I've raised, we really would be really pleased to hear from you, and my email address is on the presentation. I'll leave you with some resources that you can use that we've produced on the issue, but otherwise would be very happy to answer any questions later that people have.
That's great. Well, thank you very much, Sarah, for sharing your insights and on the city responses to a group of people who really are falling through the cracks in so many places. The initiatives you've identified with your partners and through your research are what is helping us rethink what being irregular means, undocumented, homeless, irregularized. But more importantly, they're also providing important new forms of guidance for municipal authorities anywhere on how to respond to these really critical issues. So thank you very much. So now let's turn the conversation over to our second guest, to Jan Brot, Senior Policy Advisor, Migration and Integration with the City of Utrecht, to learn about the Dutch city's leadership as a human rights city and why all residents, including the undocumented, are entitled to bed, bath, and bread. I'm delighted to introduce our next speaker. Jan Brot is Senior Policy Advisor, Migration and Integration with the City of Utrecht. In 2001, he was the first policymaker in the Netherlands to develop a system of emergency shelters for undocumented migrants. At the City of Utrecht, Jan has initiated and successfully implemented many projects working with NGOs to mainstream integration and combat illegal overstay and homelessness. Jan is the chair of the Eurocities Sub-Working Group on Undocumented Migrants and the project lead for the City of Utrecht on the CMI's project. He is also an active member of the Eurocities Working Group on Migration and Integration, a network of more than 50 member cities working on this important social pillar. Jan has a bachelor's degree in economy, a master's degree in sociology, has worked in the past with Amnesty International, the Refugee Council, and in the City of Utrecht with the social department before becoming a widely recognized senior policy leader on asylum matters in the Netherlands. Welcome, Jan. We're delighted to have you with us today. The podium is yours.
Thank you, Kim. I want to present you some ideas about the Utrecht policy and the policies are going now in the Netherlands and some developments about that. First, about the City of Utrecht. It's not a very big city, some 330,000 people, but it's growing. It's young and highly educated city, and it's becoming much more popular in Holland for people to live. It's the fourth biggest city in Holland, and now you saw this picture of also in the presentation of Sarah. It's the raw sleeping condition in the Utrecht forest area. This was homeless people from Eastern Europe and some African irregular migrants sleeping in the woods area in Utrecht, and they were getting at each other's throats. There were some fights, there were some guns, and there was really a public order situation. So we had to do something about it. And but our doing something, we had to first think about some basic principles. At first, they are the human rights treaties. It's the European Convention on Human Rights, the International Convention on the Rights of the Child, I'll come back to it later, the European Committee of Social Rights are undocumented. What kind of rights do they have? What kind of social rights do they have? And there are some more national or local ideas about necessary care and shelter for vulnerable undocumented in the municipality, and of course, very important in our policy, the public order competence of the mayor of Utrecht and of all mayors in Holland, that they can make decisions on public order situations. First, the policy objective on Utrecht policy. We have quite a simple scheme. We say the objective is to prevent and reduce illegal stay in the Netherlands, or in Utrecht especially. And the result is or a residence permit for the irregular migrant, and then after that integrating Utrecht through coaching and education and work, or what we call reconnection to the country of origin. The term reconnection is a little bit different, of course, than expel or forcibly expel. It's a person has to reconnect and find a way to what the situation in their home country is now and try to reconnect to it. What we don't want is homelessness and rough sleeping conditions on the street, because we think that is not a part of the solution, but part of the problem. The national restrictive policies are always in the Netherlands, say, for example, for rejected asylum seekers, say after 28 days, if you didn't return to your home country, you will be put on the street. And then streets are in cities, and we get the problems on our streets. What did we do for strategic ideas about our policy? One of the most successful strategy was our litigation strategy based on Human Rights Convention. In this case, it was about the European Social Charter and the UN Convention on Rights of the Child. What was the situation? Families with children or small children were put on the street by the national policy, asylum seekers, rejected asylum seekers especially, and then they had to sleep in the street, and there are a lot of problems because the mothers could be raped, or they get mugged and so on. So we thought, this is of course not in line with the UN Convention of the Right of the Child, that every child, irrespective of their status and irrespective of the situation of their parent has to have chances to develop themselves in the right way. So together with a lawyer on social rights, we did put in place what we called the winning by losing strategy for undocumented families. So what happened was that the human rights lawyer get some verdicts of the European Social Charter that it's a violation of the European Social Charter that families with children are put on the street, but that was not still legally binding in Holland. So the lawyer took us to court in a specific case, a mother with a sick child, and then what we did was we denied them access. We said, of course, they are very vulnerable, and the child is vulnerable, and the mother, all kinds of problems, very vulnerable, but our national policy is not allowing us to give them shelter. And then in that first court case, the judge ruled that that cannot be. Of course, you as a city have also human rights to keep up your human rights conventions, and you have to give shelter to this mother with child. Now this was the first verdict. There came more verdicts, and in 2011, the highest court in Holland decided that all undocumented families with children should get shelter by the government. And then we said to we as a local government said to the national government, okay, now you have to give them some shelter and food, and the children can go to school. Now there are now everywhere in Holland there are some special shelters for undocumented families with children. So this was very successful, but it was after that also a court case with the Conference of European Churches to have all undocumented migrants to get shelter, but that court case was in the end was denied. So we are now this litigation, and this is what I'm saying, this strategic implication of the litigation strategy is look at specific undocumented migrants to have and look at specific human rights conventions, and then build up a case on with different courts. Now, one of the other important strategic implication is we made up a coalition of municipalities. In about in 2010, it were more than 100 municipalities joining together on this undocumented policy. Now there are still 60, and we also, and Sarah told also about it, try to find some international coalition within Eurocities, the Breaking Good Migration, and within the specific CMICE project with now 11 cities which I'm sharing. And we are also always finding some allies within the scientific community and within with a lot of NGOs who do the work on the ground. What is not only, our policy is not only human rights oriented, it is also solution oriented and pragmatic. The essence is we give professional guidance on the moment to 800 undocumented migrants. We have, for example, a specific support center perspective for former unaccompanied minors and a medical shelter for especially people with PTSD. And we have an emergency shelter for rejected asylum seekers for about 225 undocumented migrants. And but it's always combined the bed, bath, bread, is always combined with professional guidance because we want to have a solution about it. And one of the solutions on EU migrants was that we successfully implemented an approach of a Polish organization, Barca, on EU migrants who work on homeless EU migrants and bring them back, reconnect them to their home country, for example, Poland, in a very good way and give them a future in their home country again. Now, what are the results in Utrecht? We have, the last 15 years, we have a 92% solution rate. About 59% of the matters are legalized. And that means that we just put up a new court case, give more information, because on a trustworthy relationship between the social worker of the NGO and the undocumented migrants, people were legalized. And that means that the national government or the immigration office or court, the alien court, said people could stay in Holland. The only thing we did is present the case in a different and better way. Of course, not everyone can be legalized, and also 90% are reconnected to the countries of origin. Because of the trustworthy relationship between the NGO and the undocumented migrant, then they could understand that a lot of them get legalized, but if you're not, then it's not really into it for you, and then they try to get you reconnected. What is your situation in your home country? Do you have family there? What is the human rights situation? What is the medical situation? And that results in 90% reconnection to the country of origin. 13% is back into the national asylum sector. We only lose 8% to illegal stay in the country. So of course we can't solve all the problems, but this is a very high number which we reach already for more than 15 years. Now, one of the key factors of our future citizens approach, as we call it, is that that they activate them already when they are still in guidance and within a shelter of for undocumented migrants. Because people who are sick or people who don't do anything anymore don't work on their situation and to solve the situation, and they lose all hopes. So we see that to activate, to give them all kinds of education, helps them to take matters into their own hand and to try and help together with the social workers to legalize their stay. Results is a very key factor in our policy. You have to have results combined with a human rights approach. A new development is because, of course, the national government for already 15 years didn't like that, as they call it, the cities were have their give the people some shelter, while the national government denies them shelter. So there were a lot of tensions, and also they tried to cut our finances because of these policies, but they all failed on it. And now, on the moment, we are in a very good cooperation between municipality and national government, and we hope and probably will in 2 months get an agreement between national government and local government to shelter, to guide undocumented migrants based on the local experience and based on the way the NGOs get their results. And then we hope, and we probably think so, that the national government will pay this kind of guidance and shelters who are on the local level. provisional guidance combined with shelter care and activation is the key factors for our results. If you want to contact me and want to know more, it's always possible.
Thank you very much, John, for that wonderful presentation of Utrecht's work, and we'll be rooting for you in the next 2 months. Bravo for the incredible progress you've made on these issues. Utrecht's example of what a humanitarian city can accomplish is really inspiring, and I think your winning by losing strategy is a brilliant example of using the legislative tools and legal mechanisms available to cities and to organizations to advance this work. So bravo. And of course, the human rights approach can be applied to so many domains of work, whether it's poverty reduction, services to migrants, or elsewhere. It's approaches like these that are really opening doors to new thinking about what I think sometimes feels like intractable problems. So thank you both, Sarah and John, for sharing your expertise and insights with us. Some of what you've heard today will be wrapped up for us in a new case study that the Building Inclusive Cities project will be publishing by Sarah Spencer with reference to Jan Bratt and his CIMI's city colleagues and their work on irregular migrants in EU cities. And we will be publishing, of course, more detailed profiles of some of the work described there, including the extraordinary work being led by the City of Utrecht. So thank you very much. So we've now concluded the formal portion of today's webinar, and it's time for our audience Q&A. Our audience is beginning to send through their questions. We're going to see how many we can get through. And before we get started, I'd like to initiate with the first couple of questions. And so let's begin by, talking about the CIMI's project again for a moment. The range of cities participating with the City of Utrecht is impressive. Athens, Barcelona, Stockholm, Gothenburg, Oslo, Frankfurt, Lisbon, Ghent, Zurich, Helsinki. You've got northern cities, Mediterranean cities, and quite a few in between. So, Sarah, at this point, are you starting to see some common threads that unite these cities in their response to irregular migrants, or are there specific conditions or initiatives that are emerging as critical to moving this work forward?
Kim, you're right. The cities are very diverse. They and of course cities in different countries have different responsibilities, different mandates, and have different degree of autonomy as to how much they can do of their own initiative, different from national policy, and they've got different migration history and different politics. So what is it unites them? It's the challenge they're facing from the exclusion of irregular migrants, of having irregular migrants in the city, and the impact on the city of their exclusion, whether that's a long-standing issue or something that's very recent to them, and the way in which it's making it more difficult for them to deliver whatever it is they want to achieve as cities, whether it's tackling homelessness or building cohesion or public health and so on. And I suppose they're united by wanting to talk to each other, to share the experience in order to come up with something that works better than the current approach.
Oh, that's interesting. And so literally opportunities to exchange ideas and to I guess united by the challenge exclusion and the flexibility with which they are able to seek solutions. That's very interesting. And how about you, Jan? What are your observations after working with this group of cities on this subject?
Yeah, I think it's also a coalition, what I call of the willing. I think Sarah said it earlier in our presentation. Some city officials or NGOs say, yeah, we can't talk about, there's no official policy or whatever, and then it's difficult to have a real big change in different cities, and I think these are cities that maybe some more like Barcelona, Ghent, and Utrecht, and Athens, and others maybe less than Scandinavian cities, who really speak out that okay, these undocumented migrants are in our cities, and we have to do something, and we have to solve something. That's my main focus of cities. We have to take care of our citizens, irrespective of their legal situation. So some of the cities are maybe not so far in their policies, but they want to prepare, because within the high influx in 2015 and 16, they rightly thought, okay, a part of them don't get a permit to stay and will be an undocumented migrant. And what will happen then? And what are we facing now? So maybe we can think of a policy that can help us in a few years to solve these problems. So that I think that was one of the main common goals of all the cities. We saw the high influx, and we have to do, and we have to act.
That's great. There's a will, there's a way. The coalition of the winning. I like that very much. That's great. And then another question I had, and this is one I think that many of us think about. You can clarify. I'll start with you, Sarah. So how is the work of the CIMIS project with its League of City Partners like Utrecht and others different from the sanctuary city movements that we hear about in the U.S. and that the media, certainly the media here in Canada, have picked up on this idea of a sanctuary city? Perhaps you could sort of clarify, give that some context for us based on your work.
Yes, it's quite a confusing area, isn't it? Because the term sanctuary city in the United States really means the city deciding to limit its cooperation with national government efforts to enforce immigration law in order to protect a space in which irregular or undocumented migrants, as they would say, can use public services. So the sanctuary city term really has that connotation, whereas in the UK, for instance, sanctuary city, the term is used, but it means something rather different. It's about a culture of welcome and support for asylum seekers and refugees, so not for irregular migrants, but people who are within the system or have already, asylum system, have already been accepted as refugees. And then in Canada, as I understand it, the term sanctuary city, to the extent that it's used, is about that welcome and support, but for people who are irregular. So we're using this term in different ways in different places. This isn't really what the CIMIS cities are talking about in the same way. They are looking for ways to be able to provide services despite an emphasis on enforcement. And actually, I think perhaps we'll take some guidance from this new provision from the Council of Europe, which has produced guidance on how to have a firewall, how you can avoid passing on information to the immigration authorities. So perhaps it's a sort of soft version of sanctuary city, if you like, where you don't ask for the data on irregular status, for instance, so that you don't have it, so that you can't pass it on, or you do it through NGOs so that you don't need to pass it on. But we don't see the same kind of any suggestion, I think, of overt resistance to national enforcement at all.
Very good.
Ask Jan. I don't know if Jan would disagree, but I don't think there's that same tension.
Yeah. How about you, Jan, on that question?
Yeah, I'm not sure there is not the same tension between, for example, sanctuary cities in the United States and the national government in the United States. And maybe on the moment it's extreme, but we also had all kinds of threats to cut our financial resources because of undocumented migrant policies. So, I think
what I meant, Jan, is I don't see the cities telling their police forces do not cooperate in that way. That's what I meant. Where they have that power, I don't think they do that in the same way.
Yeah, we not the same at the same level as the sanctuary cities do now. But for example, there are some mayors who in Holland who use their competence on public order and not to put rejected asylum seekers on the street in an asylum center, for example, in Utrecht or in Groningen or in other cities. That are more individual cases. And the idea of firewall is, of course, interesting, but we also have, and there's also now a national policy, and before it was only local policy, like the free in, free out policy that witnesses or victims of crime can go to police and go out freely irrespective of their legal status, because crime fighting is then more important, we think, than some individual irregular migrant. And then you can turn the discussion a little bit more around, that it's not like in the United States that you fight crime, that you have to say where every undocumented migrant is. So we did the same on people who are victims of the domestic violence or victims of human trafficking. So I think you have to really look at turning the discussion around in this way.
That's very interesting. We've got a lot of questions coming in, so I'm going to move to those questions now. Another question I wanted to ask both of you was what the sort of impact of the refugee crisis. Both of you have mentioned this. What the impact of the refugee crisis has been on the work of cities around irregular migrants, whether it's created a more pragmatic or coordinated response, or whether it's changing public responses to this work. But in fact, I've got a question, so maybe we can roll these questions up. I've got a question from Sybil Munch at the Leuphana University, and she wants to know whether what your experience has to say about cities' attitudes towards undocumented migrants. Are they in flux at the moment, given the politicization and deportation turn we're seeing? Are cities more reluctant to support irregular migrants, or are they generally taking a stand? So is there a trend that you're observing, and what has it been influenced and in what way by the refugee crisis? And maybe we can start with you, Sarah.
I think it's very important to recognize that throughout this we've been saying some cities are being inclusive, and there are other cities which are not taking the same approach. Mm-hmm. But to say how those attitudes are changing is very difficult to say without some sort of overview survey and over time. So all I can say is the impression I have most strongly is of cities wanting to be able to be more transparent about the whole issue, to talk about the difficulty of it, and of the responses that they feel they need to take, and some feeling much more constrained about that than others. So I'm very conscious that the negative political rhetoric about irregular migrants within some countries more than others makes it very difficult for cities to have an open conversation about it. Whether that's also making them actually more reluctant to do anything is something that's more difficult to say, because the whole thing is so non-open and transparent. So I haven't been so conscious in working with the cities that are, as Jan says, the coalition of the willing at the moment, of the turn which Sybil is describing, but I'm not surprised if that's what she is finding.
And Jan, across the Netherlands and maybe beyond through your work in Europe, are you seeing a change in a trend in one direction or the other?
Now, I think on the moment the trend within Holland and within the Dutch cities is that at least the let's say 25, 30 bigger cities in Holland all want to do something with undocumented migrants, and that makes a powerful force in trying to get an agreement with national government about it. So don't fight, but join forces, but join forces in a way that that the municipalities feel comfortable and think that can reach a solution. And with the last government, this negotiation get stuck, but with the new coalition, what I said, it makes it more. We are very positive to reach a result. But Sarah's right. There are all kinds of cities who think, also in Europe, who don't, and also, especially on the politicized debate, are not taking their responsibilities or do it in a more hidden way. But I think it's very important to have some cities in forefront just saying, okay, we are doing this, we get results, and let's now have a real discussion, not a politicized discussion, but a discussion on the results and what is happening in the cities. And don't ignore our problems. And I think that the transparent discussion is the way forward, although you of course need some cities to really take a stand, and that's always a difficulty to be the first.
Very good. We've got a lot of questions coming in. This one from Andreas, who's with the Open Society Foundations in Europe project. He wants to know, Jan, how you communicate and frame such a difficult topic to the public in a time of populists using this against cities and generating right-wing voters. So how do you communicate on this topic with the...
It's quite interesting. We had a local election 2 weeks ago, and of course there was also a populist party of Geert Wilders, and they only get 1 seat of the 45 seats we have in here, only 4%. But most of the other parties took a stand. We are in favor of helping giving shelter to undocumented migrants. They are really, saying we want more. So we, and why do they do that? Because in the last 15 years, the public is aware that if you don't do that, there are a lot of problems on the streets with girls getting raped, boys getting into drugs abuse, all kinds of little crime and more severe crime. And this is now, because of this policy, a lot less. And for example, our policy with BARCA, with the Polish organization on migrants from Eastern Europe, one of our biggest offense, if I call that, is the police, because they see there's less crime. There's just less crime. So it's always, and if you tell that to the public and give them the figures, and let also the police speak out, and let the politicians like the mayor or the vice mayor speak out, then everyone is, then no one is afraid to talk with the public and face the populist vote. So that's the way we do it.
Yeah, and managing that data, reporting out those results must really help too. Very impressive. I have another question here now from Young Chang on a topic we often addressed by both of you again on sustainability in the context of changes in government and regime change. So he asks about city capacity to sustain programs that might be affected by changes in government. Is there enough capacity for autonomous governance apart from the national agenda, he asks. Maybe we'll ask Sarah, would you like to respond to that?
I think we're looking at a larger question here, aren't we? Cities' capacity to sustain programs affected by changes in government. I think bringing it to our issue, we're talking about to what extent actually can cities make a difference here by being inclusive, by trying to reduce the inequality between irregular migrants and their regular residents. And the answer is they can to an extent. And this is the question about urban citizenship, isn't it? You know, to what extent can that make a difference? And I would say only to a certain point, because if a national policy framework is highly restrictive, if the national rhetoric is very alienating, if it's working against the framing that Andreas mentioned now, if it's very negative language about irregular migrants and posing them as a threat, that doesn't leave a huge amount of space for cities to make a huge difference if that's the dominant narrative and the dominant policy framework. If there's a change of government and changes the ethos there, changes the narrative, then that, of course, is going to make it easier for cities, and it goes the other way, that they might be making a difference and then there's a change of government going the other way. So I think national government is undoubtedly very important here, and I think that's why we saw that cities on the whole are trying sometimes to bend rules to be able to do this, but it's government that sets the rules.
Very good. And Jan, would you like to comment on the issue of regime change in local governments and the sustainability of some of this wonderful work you've been able to establish?
I think that's one of the important ways to deal with it, is that in our policy we always try to have some issues for every part. So we talk about, for example, more conservative parties, we talk more about public order and combating illegal stay. If we talk more with, let's say, Christian Democrat Party, we talk more about humane situation. If we talk with more Social Democrat Party or maybe Green parties, we talk more about Human Rights Party. And we mix all those together in our policy so that every party can recognize some of their ideas in our undocumented policy. And I think that's very important, because then you make it not a real political battle around it. There was the Greens took some initiative, and it was on activate and give education to undocumented migrants, and it was supported unanimously within the city council. So then, if you can reach that kind of world, then the regime or different parties becoming bigger or less big or smaller isn't as important anymore.
That's great. So not only a multi-stakeholder approach, but this non-partisan approch in the development. That's great. Now we are at the hour. We've got time, I think, for 2 more questions, if I can. It would be wonderful. The first one is a very technical question, and so we'll just try to answer it simply. It's for you, Jan, and it's from Reinhardt at the University of Sussex. And he wants to know which concrete policy measures are subsumed under the label reconnection with the country of origin, apart from deportation. That's the first part of his question. What does that mean?
What does that mean? That means first to establish a trustworthy relationship on equal basis between, most of the time, in an NGO and the undocumented migrant. It means there shouldn't be a real chance for a permit to stay. And then, if you want to reconnect, it's not push people out, but pull people back to their home country. So you try to reach out to their family. You try to reach out to employers. you give them maybe some education so they have more chances on their labor market in their home country. If they are sick, you reach out to some hospitals. So that the gap between staying here and going to their home country is becoming smaller because that are the most important measures we think about.
And I guess that relates directly to the second question, which I guess Reinhard worries that people who may have good reason to expect that they're receiving professional advice, naming themselves to the authorities, might, in the interests of reconnection, might simply result in them not being able to stay, and whether that keeps them away from emergency shelters, whether that can be a deterrent rather than an encouragement to seek the services that you've provided. Do you want to comment on that?
Yes. For example, the national government have some return centers, and then you get exactly this problem that people don't go there. Mm-hmm. So we never call it a return center. Therefore, we always look at two sides, whether to say or not. And because we always look very intensive on the legal pathways to stay here, we also look at the blue card on the moment. That's maybe a possibility. If that doesn't succeed, people understand better that's not in it for them. And of course, then take the step to go back is still a big step. And so you really have to find a way and maneuver. And sometimes people want, and some they don't want anymore. And you really have to. Therefore, we always have professional social workers to do this because it's one of the most difficult ways of guiding people, to a situation that at first time they don't really want. But in the end, then you have to help them to make their own choice about it, because staying in a country where you will always be undocumented, that's also not a very attractive situation, but it must be met by some attractive points in their home country.
Yeah. And Sarah, would you like to comment on that question?
No, because I think that relates very specifically to Utrecht, and Jan answered so clearly.
Okay. All right. Well, I do have our last question is a good one. It's for you, Sarah, and a comment from John. It's from Anna Hakami, and she says, what developments in integration policies do you foresee considering the need for integrating irregularized migrants today and in the future? So, Sarah, that's...
In which integration policies do we foresee needing to include irregular migrants?
That's right. Yeah.
Oh, sorry,
what sort of recommendations for development? So, or where we can open up integration policies to create space for integrating irregularized
Well,
migrants.
I think that raises the very good and very difficult question: is to how much integration do we need? How much integration is appropriate for irregular migrants? To what extent should services be opened up to people who are not authorized to stay? But I do think that it should be part of integration policies, as opposed to having a whole strategy and initiatives which are for regular migrants, and then somehow we have this awkward add-on on the side for people with irregular status. It would make much more sense if authorities at the national and the local level were considering those with irregular status at the same time, even if the conclusion they come to in relation to some initiatives and services is that it's not appropriate for those whose status is irregular. But at least then the question would be asked, the authority would be saying, what are our objectives here? What are the reasons why we need to provide access in a systematic way, rather than, as often the case, a more reactive, we need to do something, so we better do X, Y, or Z. One clear answer to Anna's question is that in relation to EU policy on funding integration services, it's problematic that the criteria effectively exclude irregular migrants. It's also problematic that the funding goes to national governments rather than directly to the cities. And that is one way in which integration policies very clearly could be opened up and make it easier for cities to make the changes they need.
Mm-hmm. Very good, and very good funding. That's a critical would be a critical sort of development. And how about Jan? What are your ideas around developments in integration policies that can accommodate this challenge?
I think Sarah said the right point. There must be some European grants directly going to our cities, and luckily there is a grant of the Urban Innovative Action Program of the European Commission to get really innovative projects. And in Utrecht we have the Utrecht Refugee Launchpad, of in Dutch we call it Plan Einstein, because it's on the Einstein Street, and it's an asylum center where people from the neighborhood and the asylum seekers and youngsters living together and learning together. So the youngsters and the asylum seekers are living together, also the persons who don't have a permit to stay, and they do lessons in ICT, English, international business English, and international entrepreneurship. These are all, let's say, things they can learn, and that can help to integrate in this time in the Utrecht or that society, or reintegrate in the society of their home country. Because to be, for example, an entrepreneur, you have to look at business models, you have to look at customers, you have to sell products, and it's more a way of thinking, and it's irrespective, especially with international trade, of the country you're in now. And the same is with English, of course. Many people speak English, and of course ICT. That's the same. So this project, the Plan Einstein project, I can tell you a lot more about it. Maybe something for a next webinar. But this future-free approach is really interesting, and an answer on the question Anna asked about what are the integration policies for this group you can foresee, and we are really developing a new strategy around that.
That's wonderful. That's great. Thank you. Thank you very much. We've really come to the end of our session. I always like at the end of the Q&A to close by asking our presenters a couple of short-fire questions. I think just one today. So for both of you, just simply, what is your next move? What's the next big idea on the horizon for each of you? What problem do you feel you want to tackle next? This is, again, just a very short answer from both of you about the big ideas that are carrying you forward. And let's start with you, Sarah.
Well, that's a big question. And a lot of things ongoing, like delivering successfully this guidance for municipalities, on which we hope your listeners will, participants will send in examples. But the particular area of this that we're going to focus on next is safe reporting for victims and witnesses of crime. How can we get a firewall set up that the police and national authorities are comfortable with, that would enable people to come forward if they're victims or witnesses of crime, because this is a win-win policy proposal, in the sense that the police need the evidence that the irregular migrants can provide, and the irregular migrants need the protection. So you have this in the Netherlands to an extent, and little bits elsewhere, but we think that it must be a policy on which there is possibility to gain much broader support. So from our point of view as a university, engaging in knowledge exchange on that issue with municipalities and other stakeholders.
That's great. Excellent. So more win-win policies for the coalition of the winning. I like that. How about you, Jan? What's the next big idea? Yeah.
But we want to change in our the way we receive our asylum seekers. I just told you about our Plan 9 initiative, and we really try to get that across the Netherlands and also maybe across Europe. And one of the ideas maybe we also thinking about is some legal pathways for undocumented to work, because we are in a booming economy. There are shortages on the labor market, for example, in care or in ICT or others, and then we get people from the Philippines or whatever to take these jobs, while there are also some undocumented about it. So some idea about the European blue card and the green card in a new fashion is maybe we will try to find.
That's brilliant. More pathways to more solutions through the EU Blue Card, bringing people together, taking advantage of the tremendous work that you've already invested in your city. Wonderful. I must thank both of you. Our time has run out. So on behalf of all of our participants, the city's migration team, I'd like to thank Sarah Spencer and Jan Braat for a brilliant exchange of ideas. I'd like to thank Evelyn Sue, our brilliant learning exchange coordinator, and the production team here at Ryerson University. To our audiences in cities of migration everywhere, I'd like you to imagine this excellent work being interpreted in your city, adapted by your organization, or changing your neighborhood. We'd like to hear your stories and share more good practice, so please stay connected.